So we're going to do an assembly of a Aerotech reloadable i300. The reloadables are complex, but they are easy if you follow the process. With all of these motors, I would recommend that you follow the instructions every single time you do the build. And I say that as someone that I've built probably over 100 of these motors, and I follow the instructions every single time, because there are enough pieces here that if you don't follow the instructions, you will miss a piece, and then you will create either a pipe bomb or a very, very expensive Roman candle. Neither of those are good outcomes. So to begin with, for this specific motor, we need a forward seal disc. That doesn't happen for every motor. Speak to the vendor if you want to know whether you need it, but we do need it for this specific reload. And then we have a casing. This particular casing is made by Dr. Rocket. We have a forward closure, the forward seal disc, the casing itself, which is labelled here as a 38480, and that's the Aerotech nomenclature for this particular size casing, and it matches the label here, which says we need a 38480 case. And it even says on this label here that we need the forward seal disc. So this is the i300 in this casing. After closure, we're off. Hopefully this goes better than the one I just did, where we tried to cut off on the easy end with the tape and it just didn't go. So we'll run around the tape. That's how it's supposed to happen. And inside here we have a single bag wrapped in the instructions. Do not throw the instructions away. However tempting it may be to think that you know how to assemble these, do not throw them away. In the bag we have a bag of bits, which we will use all of, and then a liner containing the grains. In this particular case, this is a 4-grain motor, and in construction, this is your insulator that is preventing the heat of these damaging your aluminium, and your aluminium is your pressure vessel. Get anything wrong here, all goes wrong. We're going to do initially identification of components. You will notice a large number of components here, and they're all important in different ways. I'm going to open up the instructions because I'm going to demonstrate good practice in making these motors. And the instructions come in 2 pieces. We have the first piece is the complete reload delay kit, which refers to the assembly of the front end of the motor, which goes in here, comprising the delay and the ejection charge that goes with that delay. This is the bit we'll assemble first, and then we have another set of instructions for assembling that into the rest of the motor. I'm going to place these down in front of me. Do I adventurously try and put them that way up, knowing that I've no chance of reading them? Oh, that's a great idea. Yes. I want that bit. So we're going to do the front piece first. This is the forward closure. This sits at the top of the motor underneath your recovery bay, and we will assume that you are going to use motor ejection. Sitting in front of that, we have the ejection charge itself, which sits in here. We have a cover for that to hold the ejection charge in. Inside here, we will assemble a spacer insulator, which sits in the bottom. We will assemble the delay and the delay insulator. At the back of the delay insulator there will be a spacer, and that entire assembly will fit inside here. First thing we're going to do is I'm going to prepare a tissue, because I am going to grease all of these O-rings, and I'm going to do so all at the same time to save me some hassle later. When you apply the grease, you are not smothering them in grease. You are just putting the tiniest amount of grease on your finger, smoosh it around, and you're just trying to make them look shiny and wet. If you can see a lump of grease on the O-ring, you have put too much on it. And for a close-up on the camera, I'm going to show the difference between the two. And if anyone wants to lean in to see the difference, this is very dry where I haven't put any grease on. This is shiny where I have put the grease on. And you're not putting any more than that. And you might find, if you're lucky, that one lump of grease can do the whole lot. I haven't quite got enough of my fingers to do everything here. Okay, all four of those are shiny. I'm going to take this opportunity, since my fingers are covered in grease, to grease the threads of the casing. And I'm just going to put a little bit of a lump in there, smoosh it around. I'm not too worried about spreading it on the threads, because when I screw the closures in, they're going to move this all around for me anyway. So I'm not too worried. I'm just going to preemptively put some there while I've got greasy fingers. Grease out the way so I don't spread it over everything. Clean the grease off, because you don't want it on any of the grains, especially not the delay grain, because it will slow down the burn of your delay grain and then change the maths. You don't want that. So, forward closure. We will place in the insulator spacer. That sits in the bottom all the way down. We will now assemble the delay into the paper insulator, and we will put the spacer at the back. Depending on the motor you get, this spacer may not exist at all, or it may be smaller or larger. The reason why that changes is that the different propellants cause different regression rates on this delay. And since the delay is lit at the same time as the propellant, a fast burning aggressive propellant will erode the delay faster, and a slow burning propellant will erode it slowly but for a longer time. So the delay grains vary in thickness. Just going to push that in, push that down to the bottom. You'll notice this sits out the top, and that's because it needs to sit inside this O-ring, which sits in the bottom. Just push that down. And you won't be able to feel this, but I will feel, as I push this in, there is a gentle click as it sits in the O-ring. And you'll notice that it is completely flush at the bottom of the forward closure. The forward closure is now assembled, and we can set that aside for the moment. We are now going to assemble the grains into the liner. Again, this is your heat insulator liner. Do not forget it, otherwise you'll burn your casing. And we're just going to temporarily stage that inside here whilst we now assemble the rest of the components. Now, it's at this point that I want you to do two things. Firstly, nominate which end of this is the forward and the back. I personally think of my right as the forward, and I think of my left as the back, because the components that go in each end are now different, and you don't want to mix up your O-rings and get the wrong O-ring in the wrong end. The second thing is, I guarantee you that at some point in your rocketry hobby, you will be holding one of these cases, and your subconscious mind will want to look inside it. At this point in time, your subconscious mind will instruct your hand, with no conversation whatsoever with your conscious mind, to turn the casing over. If you are not holding the bottom of the casing at this point in time, gravity reaches up, grabs your expensive propellant grains, throws them on the ground, puts micro cracks in them, and now you've created a bomb. So, I will say to you now, every single time you are working with an Aerotech reloadable casing, get into the habit of holding it like this, so you have a hand over the end of it, because then when your subconscious brain tries to screw you, that happens, not the other. Okay? Everyone's laughing, and I have seen it happen multiple times. So, I'm going to go back to the instructions so I make no mistakes. And my instructions tell me that having greased and assembled this, I now need to put the O-ring on the forward seal disc. My instructions do have things where I can put my O-rings so I can be sure which is which. I've already used this one and I've already used this one. That is the aft insulator that goes there. So it's telling me now to install the forward seal disc O-ring. This should gently slip over the top. It is worth, especially if it's not your case, looking in this seal before you do anything else, because when we put this in, you will see they become invisible when they are in here. And when the last person used this casing and forgot to take the O-ring out of the forward seal disc, you now try to put another O-ring in its place, confuse the hell out of yourself for a few minutes, whilst you can't get a second O-ring into a groove designed for one. And this then installs on the forward end of your liner. Note again, I have picked the right hand side as my forward end. That's just my way of doing it. I'm going to cheat a little bit and use the table to get it in, and we are in. Forward seal disc is done. Insert the propellant grains, we're already done. Blah, 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 blah. It's insert the forward O-ring into the end of the case. These O-rings are different. Read the instructions every time, because every single reload has different O-rings, and in some cases the thick O-rings at the back, and some cases the thick O-rings at the front. Some cases they're the same size. In this case, the forward O-ring is the thinner of the two, and it goes in the front, in front of the forward seal disc, so that it appears like that. And now I have realised I have forgotten to drill the delay grain. So I need to pop out the delay grain with a tool that is not in my toolbox.
Stuart, while we do this, someone just asked a question which is probably worth answering.
Yes.
Why are there O-rings in the case?
The O-rings act as the pressure seal, and by virtue of containing the pressure, you also contain the flame inside the burning part of the motor. So this O-ring here is preventing that creeping around the edge, creeping through the gap in these threads, and then coming out of the side here. For the drilling of this, my customer, who is over there, wishes for it to be drilled to 8 seconds. And if we refer back to the label, this is a 14-second adjustable. So to go from 14 down to 8, we need to remove 6. And this is a larger version of the DMS we've just seen. If we face the delay with the -4, that removes 4 seconds. If we face the delay with the -8, that removes 8 seconds. We need to remove 6. And the way we're going to do that, we're going to insert it into the -8, and then we have a washer here that essentially removes 2 from the subtraction. so it turns it into a -6 because it is not drilling as deep with the washer in place. Everyone happy with that? So I'm going to drill this badly. Notice a relatively clean hole there. If you do get a bit of swarf in there, just go in with the drill bit, clean it out. But be careful, obviously, not to make the hole deeper than it was before. And then I'm just going to reassemble this back the way it was. I've already got my spacer there. I'm going to put the drilled hole facing the propellant, which in my case means that way round so that the spacer is here. The flat side faces the ejection charge, and when I put this in the casing, it's going to go in that orientation with the hole facing the propellant. The way I phrase it to people I'm teaching is all of the holes go together. So the hole you've drilled, the hole created by the spacer, and the hole in the front of the motor all go together. Put that back together, and we will thread that in. I'm only going to go about halfway in, and that's to give me some room at this end. Refer back to instructions. Assemble, assemble, assemble. Thread the forward closure on we've just done. Now it says install the aft insulator. When you're installing the aft insulator, it has to sit on the edge of the liner. It's very, very easy to get it. I'm exaggerating for film effect here, but it's very easy to get it into that position. Drop it in, and it needs to sit like that on the end of the liner, very flat. Then it says install the aft O-ring, removing random human hair from O-ring first. We do not want human hairs in here. Who's got very short white hair? Probably my beard. Aft O-ring in place, so it sits flat, and then we're going to install the nozzle inside the O-ring. If this doesn't go in easily, you can just put a bit of grease on it, but actually I've managed to get that one. No, I haven't. I'm going to grease it. Little bit of grease, specifically on the outside. It will go. We're in. So the nozzle is flat, level. Remove the grease. Clean the fingers. And now we're going to install the aft closure. At this point, I'm now going to wind the front closure all the way in until it is absolutely sealed, and you do not want to see any gap here. And now we wind the rear in. Until it is all the way in. I have greasy hands, which is why I'm using tools. So the obvious, this is called a strap wrench. There we are, and I'm now done all the way up. There's no gap here. I can't get my fingernail in there or anything. We're all good. So this is now assembled. We're not yet ready to fly though, because we're still missing the ejection charge. For this demo, I am not putting the ejection charge in, for the simple reason that this is actually going to be disassembled before flight for other reasons. But what you would do is take your ejection charge, you put the motor upright, you put a little bit of ejection charge in there, and you want to tap it down so it sits through the hole and falls to the top of the delay. If you don't do that, the delay can burn without igniting the ejection charge, and then you fill up the rest of it, put it all in the hole, and force the plastic cap over the top, and you are then very literally ready to fly. What questions do people have?
So if someone is using a case with a system like this, what is the most common way to retain that case within the rocket?
Okay, all of high power motors thrust from the rear end. And that's done so that you can have a rocket built and put motors of different length inside it. So your motor casing thrusts here and your retention is here. It is possible for some casings, particularly for the 54mm motors, to come with a forward closure that has a thread in it that you can use to mount in your rocket. That's used in very limited circumstances. I would not recommend designing for it, because what it stops you doing is using a casing of a different length for other reasons. Because you now can't move where that thread is, it has to mate up with the thread. Instead, what we tend to supply is a retainer that sits on the back that glues or screws onto the back of your rocket. This slides in and then the screw piece goes up at the top, and that means that this aft closure is both your thrust and your retention against the motor coming out the back. As I've done this, I have just thought of something, which is that this motor is actually making a little bit of noise as I move it back and forth. Now, a little bit of noise here is fine because the grains are actually slightly smaller than the liner, and this one's okay. But if you have a situation where things are moving around, speak to me before you launch it, because it might be you've misassembled it, and we refer to Exhibit A of that means it's going to go bang, bad fire, bad day. More questions?
So when you buy a Cicerone case,
Yes.
you buy the case separate to the closure. For the Aerotech system, how is it sold?
You can buy them as individual parts. We don't bother importing them that way. We actually buy these as a complete set. So the set that you would get would be the casing, which is what we call the metal tube, the aft closure, the forward closure, and depending on the casing, the forward seal disc. And you get all 3 or 4 of those components in one purchase. I would recommend, for those that have been here for both demos and have seen the DMS being assembled, the DMS is way easier. The advantage of the RMS is that the reloads are significantly cheaper, but the hardware is significantly more expensive. So it depends on quantities of flights, the nature of what you want, as to which is better for you. But I would say for most competitions, the DMS, which is essentially just a enlarged single-use motor, and I'll get it out again for both the camera and for those here. That is almost exactly how it arrives and almost exactly how it flies. So it's a much, much easier solution, but you are paying more. This typically is about 20% more than the pure reload cost inside the aluminium case, but you do have to buy the aluminium case, and that itself can be more expensive than the reload on its own. And the break even is typically 5 to 7 flights, depending on specific motors and casings and the like. Questions?
Do you have rental options for your cases?
We do. So any events that we attend, which are many, most of the club events, and we also attend events like the National Rocketry Championship run by UK SEDS, we do have rental equipment with us. I will say, coming back to the difference between DMS and RMS, at a competition day, you don't want the stress of building a motor. You don't want the stress of us sitting there with a rental where you lose your rocket and then we come chasing you asking for a credit card to pay for the casing you've just lost. So for competitions, I would recommend single-use DMS every single time. You do not need the stress. If you're doing other projects where maybe you've got a full launch day because you're doing an altitude attempt or you're doing a particular CANSAT project, the RMS can be appealing for other reasons, but you have more time. You often will have trackers in there, which means that finding things can be easier.
For the DMS,
Yes.
are they all sold in one pack? one motor in a pack?
Yes, all DMS motors specifically are 1 per pack. However, some of the single-use motors, typically the Ds through the Gs are 2 in a pack. G is the boundary. Some of the Gs are 2 in a pack, some of the Gs are 1 in a pack. For the National Rocket Championship, you're right on the boundary. So depending on the particular motor you're after, you might get 2 in a pack, you might get 1 in a pack, depending on what you want.
Are there any final very common errors with assembling these motors?
Not reading the instructions, and I know that's going to come across to everyone as I know what I'm doing. Genuinely read these instructions. It's so likely that you will flip the O-rings. The spacers will go in the wrong place. Or, in the act of unpacking this in a field, you drop a piece on the floor. You don't realise you've dropped a piece on the floor, and because you're not following the instructions, it's not there shouting at you saying, put me in the case. That piece is then missing. You now have a case missing a part, and you are big fire territory again.
You mentioned igniters earlier in the talk. Is there any difference in the igniters between the two motor types?
No, in fact, the internals of a DMS are nearly identical to the RMS. What you're paying your extra 20% for is 2 things. Firstly, the fiberglass case that this goes in, and secondly, you're paying Aerotech to assemble it for you. But if you look at the DMS motor specs and the RMS motor specs, you'll notice that they are almost 1 for 1. They're almost the same between the two, and therefore the igniters are also nearly identical. We've got a slightly unfair comparison here because this is a 29mm H motor and this is a 38mm I motor, but even then the igniters are essentially the same thing.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, disposal of the spent grains and hardware, is that done on site? Do you take responsibility for that?
We don't generally do so. It can be very messy. Come with gloves. Baby wipes work an absolute treat. So go to the nappy aisle, get yourself some baby wipes. They work really, really well for spent propellant. And come with a carrier bag. Quite often I tell people to keep the bags they came in, and then you can just pour the motor in, and it'll flake into horrible charcoal fragments that will mark everything they touch.
But it's not deemed hazardous waste, it goes in the ordinary.
Not. If you have a part spent grain,
Right.
So let's say you misassembled your motor and you created your Roman candle, you might or might not have burned everything in that motor.
Okay.
At that point, I would soak that in water before you dispose of it, because the water will be absorbed by the grain. It will then become completely inert permanently.
Right.
It's not even viable when it dries out again. It just doesn't work ever again.
Okay.
They clean well with baby wipes, water, light soaps. Do not use any real chemicals, no acetones, no IPAs. No aggressive cleaning products, no sandpaper or scouring pads. Genuinely, a baby wipe will do wonders to this stuff, even stuff that's been on there a while.
I appreciate it's not related necessarily to this because you talked about the delay charge, but the electronic delayed parachute deployment,
Yep.
how does that tie within this?
That's a really good question. So both on the DMS and the RMS, the only difference you would take would be that you wouldn't bother drilling the delay because you've no reason to adjust it, but you assemble everything as normal. This alludes to actually what Ben was saying earlier on about the story that just because you don't need the ejection charge, you do still need the delay because that acts as a structural and insulating part inside the case. You literally do not put your ejection charge in there, and this just gets set aside. Do bear in mind this is black powder. You are probably not licensed to keep black powder. If that's the case, or you don't know what I'm talking about, do not take this home. Do not take it back to uni halls.
Do not experiment.
Do not set fire to it, because it is black powder. Okay? The easiest way to deal with this is just to hand it to us or to one of the other vendors, and if you're coming back, we'll just put it in a little baggie with your name on it, and you can pick it up from us next time. We can store it for you. If you're not and you're never going to use it again, it'll go in our spare pot for when other people have lost their black powder, and we'll just give it to someone else for their next motor instead.
So if you're not using that black powder, how do the electronic deploys work?
You can use this in your electronic deployment charges.
Right.
It's kind of out of the scope of this talk.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
But you generally find, for reasons that are beyond this conversation, this wouldn't be enough if you're using electronic deployment.
Okay.
So you would then need another source of black powder to top up your charges.
Interesting.
Yes. And the simple answer to that is normally if you're using electronic deployment, you're doing dual deployment and you need 2 charges. And there's only one here.
Okay.
That's the simple answer.
Okay.
But if you're doing dual deployment, you need to size the charges correctly. With single deployment, we don't generally care, because providing there's enough ejection force to get the nose cone and the parachute out, it doesn't really matter if that's too much, within reason. If you're doing dual deployment, you do not want to push your apogee separation so hard that you cause the separation at your main. So sizing the charges for dual deployment is much more important.
If you have opted for electronic deployment,
Yes.
and you haven't put your black powder, do you need to cap the motor off still, like you do with other brands?
So you are not using black powder from the motor, and you are using an ejection charge and an electronic deployment somewhere else. You don't need to. I probably would just put the plastic cap on, but that's just for sealing purposes. I don't think it's probably necessary, but I would. You're going to get a small amount of fire come out the front when that delay burns through, but it's going to be small. It depends really how sensitive your rocket is as to how much of a problem that's going to be, but putting the plastic cap on is near zero effort.